So I'm not saying it completely yet, but probably. Will probably just be multiple choice. The reason why is I'm just in general a nice guy. You've thought that, right? That's what I thought. What?
You just want the time off.
And I've got to get grades done that week. So it is very challenging going into the holiday season to find the time for that. So the final is probably going to mostly be multiple choice. Okay? Any questions on any of that? As I get ready to start, and we get Motley Crue off the screen, wherever to be banned, trash will be eaten. Let's see, that's not right. I do want to say, as you're getting ready to finish your first semester of school and you're going into enrollment, I've enjoyed y'all as a class. I do want to say this. I do have I typically out of players teach 4 other classes. If you're interested in that, I want to at least give you a pitch on it. But we've been hitting cognition a lot throughout the course of the semester. Learning and memory was heavily a component of cognition. So we're going to hit some other areas of it. We're going to really look at the end of this lecture on IQ, and we're going to look at some aspects of just thinking, which is different than consciousness, okay? Relevant classes after this one for this area would probably be cognitive science, taught by David Leland. What do we call it? Cognitive neuroscience would probably touch on it all also. Okay. All right. So just some basic definitions. None of these should come out as anything that's all that surprising to you. Cognition is a mental state. It's a mental activity. Remember when we defined learning and memory? Some of what we said was changes in behavior. That's a lot of how we looked at learning and memory. But the other part of that definition was or mental states. Okay? Changes that just could occur in terms of a mental state. We're picking that up here in a more global definition of cognition. Changes in mental activity that's associated with thinking, as you contemplate stuff, as you work through the trolley dilemma examples from class last time, examples of thinking there. So mental activities associated with thinking, with cognition or knowing, remembering, and communicating information. So we're really trying to expand or blow up the idea, expand the idea of how we've labeled cognition so far to be more than just learning and memory, specifically learning and memory that we measure with observable changes. We can think of concepts. Now, thinking often occurs in terms of this idea of concepts, where we mentally group things together of similar objects, similar ideas, or people. We could also put attitudes inside of that and things like that. So this is the kind of groupings that we do in our mental state. These are the kind of groupings that we do in our mental state to lock people together. There's some benefits in having overarching concepts. One of them is that it simplifies our thinking. Now that's both good and bad. It simplifies our thinking. Once we're able to label things and put them inside of a group, we have to be less concerned, or we are less concerned at that point in time, and all the details that go with that individual. The weakness of it is we're putting all the characteristics of that group onto that individual or onto that thought. And those, in fact, may not be accurate. So we can have weaknesses associated with that in terms of overgeneralizing aspects of the group to a concept or an individual or something like that. Sounds like I'm going hoarse. Maybe it's just a buildup of phlegm. It could be that too. Inside of this idea of concepts, we often make prototypes. Where a prototype can be thought of as the archetype, the ideal of a particular concept. The prototype, the archetype, the ideal of a particular concept, and we tend to measure everything associated with that. All of those things can help us in terms of our thinking because it simplifies things down, but it also brings along weaknesses associated with it. All right. There are things we can do that facilitate, but they also, each one of them, have weaknesses associated with our thinking. And none of these should be all that surprising. When we're engaged in a thinking situation, where we're engaged with new information, we often work by trial and error. We try something, and if it doesn't work, then we try something else. The weakness associated with that is if we try something and it works good enough, we often stop. So a lot of our thinking is just kind of trial and error basis of it. The second one is an algorithm. It's like how in some ways you learn early math. We learn how to do order of operations. Here, this will prepare you for your calculus. We learn how to do order of operations by learning laws, learning rules. Multiply and divide before you add and subtract, go left to right. Now you're ready for all of those things on Facebook. What happened? An algorithm. Step-by-step instructions. And if you follow those, you're pretty well guaranteed an outcome. It's how I cook. I go to the cookbook, like tomorrow morning I'll make biscuits. I love biscuits. And I just follow step-by-step instructions how to do that. It's also how you, in a lot of ways, do molecular biology. You just have a protocol and you follow it. You denature the proteins at this temperature for this length of time, and then you add in this much of the other substance, and there you go. The weakness of an algorithm is if you get off of the procedure, if you don't follow the step-by-step nature of it perfectly, you're guaranteed of what? Failing. It also stifles creativity tremendously. It stifles creativity tremendously because, by definition, you're doing what something tells you to do. You're not creatively thinking about it. You can come up with heuristics, which are simpler, more flexible kinds of strategies to do. A heuristic would be something along the lines of how something should work. It should work like this, so I'll try it that way. It's kind of a mix of the idea of trial and error with the idea of a schema. Remember what schemas were, these things of how everything fits together, trial and error. I'll try something, and if it doesn't work, I'll change it. Well, with a heuristic, you're generating a concept map, if you will, that gives you certain things to try. How many of you have ever had an insight or an aha moment? Those are kind of fun. I used to teach Intro to Neuroscience here. And if you remember back to the very beginning of this class, What's the most common value for resting membrane potential? It's usually negative 70 millivolts. And in that class, what we do for about 2 weeks is we learn biophysical properties of membranes so that you understand why it's negative 70 millivolts. And that sounds really that by definition right there sounds complicated. It's actually pretty straightforward. And students learn it mostly through an aha moment because they try to make it really hard and complex, and they're losing the simple steps in the process of it. And usually what happens when I teach that is I just have to go over it in slightly different ways until suddenly the student is like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. Now I get it. And you never miss it again as to why it's like that. So there are times when we just learn by, oh yeah, I now get it. What's interesting when that happens is if you do studies like that where subjects in an fMRI and they're looking, say, at a computer monitor that has a simple logic kind of process, where you have to figure out an answer, and usually you just get it right away. It's almost like a riddle. Have you ever done a riddle where the thing that's hard about a riddle is the cue that's given to you via the riddle is designed to lead your thinking down a different pathway. So if you can avoid that and think of what's being asked of you in a slightly different way, usually you get the answer to the riddle all at once in kind of this aha moment. I get it now. If you study that of a person who's in an fMRI scan and they have that aha moment, what you actually get is a tremendous amount of activity in the frontal lobe. It's like the frontal lobe suddenly said, I thought of it, I figured it out, followed by activity in the right temporal area, in the right temporal lobe. So we can even measure the activity of this, oh, I put the pieces together and now it makes sense to me inside of the brain. Tends to be focused in the frontal lobe, followed by right temporal activation. All of these can lead to errors, a lot of these that we've talked about before. When we were talking about critical thinking, so some aspect of this is a little bit of review. We can get, we can always be, have a danger of a confirmational bias, seeing or thinking, judging a conclusion based on what we anticipate seeing there. That goes back to our idea. Mental sets, available heuristics are very similar. Mental set you can think of as a schema. One of the problems we make when we're engaging in a thought process is we tend to either select the wrong mental set to use when we think about it, the wrong concept, cluster of concepts, or we use whatever worked in the past, our available heuristic. How many of you have changed your study technique since you've come to university compared to what you used in high school? Did you do that right away? Or did you have to learn how to do that through a few initial exams? Often what happens is you use an available heuristic. This is how I did study. This is how I'll study now. Because it's available. It's the one you most recently used. It's the one that you most commonly use. But now it's not working as well anymore. People will often use intuition. Just go by their gut. This is what I think's right. That's an awful way to live life, right? Because really what you're doing is basing decisions on how you feel. I've always wanted to ask people that were like, I used my gut. Really, did you just eat at Hilltop? Because I can't imagine the bad decisions you're making now, right? Yeah, I ate at Hilltop once when my daughter was a freshman. That was really, you guys, I paid for that. That was, oh my gosh. Wow. Anyway, okay. Overconfidence. Do you ever run into somebody who's overconfident? I can't stand overconfidence. I'm not confident is early. Anyway, so yeah, overconfidence, right? I know what's right, and I will not look at the relevant data that's associated with any aspect of it. I know the right answer. I won't look at other competing pieces of information to try and come up with an answer associated with it. Belief perseverance, we all want to continue to believe what we've always believed. Isn't that easy? I mean, that's just an easy thing to do. It requires such little mental activity. It requires such little mental activity to just continue to believe what you've always believed, even when challenged with new thoughts and new ideas. It's just tough. Framing. Remember when we had our two friends crash cars down on the roads? The way that you frame questions, the way that you frame information can impact the way people think tremendously. Have you been following the Kyle Rittenhouse trial in Wausau? Is that the town? Is that where it's at? Okay. It's been an interesting trial. One, because the judge is so active inside of it. But you can also watch how the lawyers on both sides, on the prosecution and the defense, are attempting to frame witnesses, attempting to frame questions as they work back and forth through that trial. And you can see the judge, who's, as I said, is incredibly involved in the trial, see how he's either challenging or letting go particular ways that things are being framed. So the way information is framed to us can cause tremendous issues. We can study thinking in humans. We also can study thinking in animals. Some of these should not be surprising whatsoever. Cognition, learning, and memory. We've looked at that multiple times in this class. We could go back and look at it again if we need to, but we don't have to, unless you want to. It raises the question, can animals count? Probably not in the way that we tend to think of counting. But they can do magnitude. So the concept of more versus less. Rats can do that. Sorting, being able to select things into particular categories. That's an aspect of discrimination and generalizability. To sort something, you've got to be able to discriminate. Classical conditioning showed us discrimination is one of the things that can come out of that. Tool usage. When I lived in Singapore, when I lived in Asia, one of my faculty members studied tool usage in this group of primates that lived on islands off the Indonesian coast, and how they would open clamshells to be able to eat, and how they would use coconuts to be able to open the clamshells. Basic tool use. So yeah, you can see all kinds of examples of this inside of animal behavior. So what we see in human allows us to be able to transfer to animals or vice versa in that regard. Okay, that's just a basic introduction into thinking. Any questions on that? One of the more interesting aspects of cognition and thinking that we're going to talk a lot about is speech production. So let's do a few slides on that. Anybody in here majoring in CSD, Communication Sciences Disorder? That's an excellent department. Anyway, language. Babbling starts at about 4 months of age. It's unrelated to sounds produced by the infant. Okay, so it's not, just a gurgling sound or anything like that. It is aspects of what will be word construction. It does continue to develop to about out to 10 months of age when the child will start using, can you put your phone up, please? Okay, thank you. Can start using basic household words. Or will start developing the usage of basic household words. About a year, one word will develop, a one-word thing will develop. For my oldest daughter, it was Dada. I had lived in the moment. It was fantastic. What's interesting for language development is it takes about a year almost before the child will start stringing together two words together into a two-word sentence. So that's a pretty slow process of language development. Birth to 1 year to get to a single word. 1 year to 2 years to start stringing together a two-word sentence. Sometime after 2 years, literally an explosion of language happens, and the child just does not stop talking. So it's just like they're adding words and adding sentences or word construction on a regular basis together. So that would suggest, at least in terms of neural development, something's happening at about this time as it relates to language, which allows the child to go from this very slow, methodical production of language to suddenly, not having mastery of it, but suddenly being able to work strongly inside of it. Okay? For language, along with some other things, there's what we term a critical period. Now, I did not bring this up in terms of development, so let me say it here. A critical period is a time during development when an individual has to be exposed and begin to use, that information or that ability, or it will never fully develop. It might develop some, but it's never going to fully develop or develop with the ease that it can before the critical period. One of the easiest and most pronounced critical periods that we have is language development. The critical period for language development tends to exist up to about 7 years of age. If an individual has not been exposed to language or structured language prior to 7, they typically will not develop it in life. And there has been some unfortunate cases where that has been seen. It's also critical for second language learners, or more. If you learn a second language prior to the onset of the critical period, it's pretty easy and pretty seamless. Or a different language. There also seems to be a secondary critical period for language, which seems to be somewhere around puberty. In that what you learn with another language, a second language, a third language, before puberty, you tend to retain, even if you don't use that particular language. Now, you may not be able to generate every aspect of every word that you wanted to if you've not spoken that language for a while, but you will very quickly be able to pick it back up again. You know, so as I said, when we lived in Singapore, I tried to learn Mandarin. That was an absolute disaster, okay? My wife tried to learn Mandarin with me. That was an absolute disaster. My youngest child, when we moved there, Sadie, was 6. So she took Mandarin for 5.5 years while we lived there. She actually got real good at it. We left right when Sadie, right at the point at which Sadie was entering puberty. And now she doesn't speak, she came to Altoona. Altoona is not rich in Mandarin speakers. So she did not use it tremendously, okay? But that skill is still there inside of it. So She's looking at taking Mandarin here at the university. We were talking about it the other day, and she just starts talking in Mandarin Chinese because it's still functionally there. So critical periods are important. If you're involved with young children, get them in additional language classes, and get them in additional language classes earlier if you can. It's a great thing to do. The brain is critical for language, and there are 3 brain regions which are important for language. Language is typically located in the left hemisphere. Okay, so what do we mean by that? Remember our brain, outer layer of the brain is the cortex. We have 4 lobes in the cortex: frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital. We have a very deep groove called a fissure, which runs right down the middle of the cortex, separating it into the left cortex and the right cortex. If we remember back to Vision and Joe, all the way back at the beginning of class, we hopefully have memory of being able to present information into one visual field, and it goes to the opposite side cortex, opposite side hemisphere. Remember when Joe could name things which were in his right visual field, but could not name things which were in his left visual field? Now we begin to understand why that's the case. If it was in his left visual field, it goes to his right hemisphere. Why is that?
The optic chiasm.
Okay, the optic chiasm. What about the optic chiasm? No. Optic chiasm's right. Why is something in the left visual field going to the right side of Joe's brain? What?
Corpus callosum?
His was transcepted, so it would, in your brain, yes. In his brain, no. It involves the retina. Huh?
The heavy retinas?
Yeah. Remember the hemiretinas differentiate which side of the brain they go to. So if it's in Joe's left visual field, that information ends up in his right brain because information from the right lateral hemiretina stays on the ipsilateral side, information from the left nasal hemiretina goes to the contralateral side. Okay? So if it's in his right brain and he doesn't have a corpus callosum, he can't name it because that information's on the wrong hemisphere of the brain. But if it's in his right visual field, it goes to his left hemisphere, he can name it. Why? Because the areas critical for speech production are primarily on the left side of the brain, on the left hemisphere of the brain. So that's why he can do that particular task. The 3 areas that we're interested in, the first 2 are named after the people that discovered them. I don't know why the third one's named what it is named. The first one is Broca's area, the second one is Wernicke's area, and the third one is a neural pathway that connects the 2, called the arcuate fasciculus. The arcuate fasciculus connects Broca's area to Wernicke's area. Now, what do these do? What do these 2 particular brain regions do? Broca's area is critical for the production of language. It's critical for the production of language. An individual with a lesion to Broca's area can understand the language, but they can't produce it. They can understand the meaning of language, but they can't produce language. They might be able to produce some mild words, a few words here and there, but by and large they cannot produce language. To the point that they can't even use answer yes or no questions. And it's not the loss is not their inability to control their vocal cords and expend air out of the lungs and through their oral cavity. It's the production of language. They can't use sign language either. So it's the meaning of it's the meaning of the words that are lost, or the production of the words that are lost. An individual with Wernicke's aphasia, so aphasia is an impairment in language. Wernicke's aphasia, the individual loses the meaning of words. Loses the meaning of words. They can produce a word, it just has no meaning. As we have a conversation, back and forth and back and forth, you say things, I understand what you're saying, and then I produce a comment back to you. And there is internal consistency in the logic in terms of what is being said. Someone with Wernicke's aphasia can say words, they just don't mean anything. It's almost called like a word salad. Imagine a large bowl that just has a bunch of words put in it, and the person just tosses. It's like a tossed salad. And a word comes up and is said, and another word comes up and is said, and another word comes up and is said. But there's no connection between those words. It's just the production of words. So in that case, the individual can say things, there's just no meaning associated with it. A few individuals will have a lesion of the arcuate fasciculus. Will have a lesion of the arcuate fasciculus, the connection between the two. In this case, the person can understand the meaning because it's not, the Wernicke's area is not lesion. At some level, they do have the ability to produce language because Broca is still there. But someone with an arcuate fasciculus or conduction aphasia will show characteristics of both because the two brain regions are not communicating with each other at all. So they will produce less words, and the words that they do produce do not have any meaning associated with them at all. So as I said, our communication sciences disorders major at Eau Claire is excellent. And they have a aphasia camp you can do this in the summer, if you're in that major, where you're working with people, I think primarily with Broca's aphasia. So the inability to produce words, the inability to produce oral communication. Thinking can also, at the far extreme, exist in terms of creativity. Where does creativity come from? What is creativity? If we study people that on some particular measure, for some particular reason, we label them as creative, we find a few things that are associated with it. They tend to have very high aptitudes. Creative people tend to be independent. Why would they be independent? Why would someone who's creative be independent? Yeah. Huh? They're thinking on their own, sure. Yeah. You ever had a novel concept, a novel idea that you thought was really, really good, and somebody said, no, that's not right. So someone who's creative has to be able to be an independent thinker. They're not hindered or tethered by the common thoughts or the thoughts of most people. Creative people tend to have very high aptitudes. They tend to exhibit independence. They often have an intense interest in the problem. They often have an intense interest in the problem at hand. So one of the things I love to do is game plan a sporting event. So coaching is great for me. Our team has actually an excellent player on it. And if I was playing against our team at Regis, I would double team this lady. So I'm really interested in that. So I have an intense interest in it. So in the evenings, I'm constantly thinking about particular offensive sets that can be used to get this person open. Intense interest in a problem does not mean while you're doing it, you're working real hard. It means that while you're doing other things, you're also still thinking about this. It's something in your mind that you constantly are going back to. Importantly, there's a willingness to restructure the problem. I said this with riddles earlier. If you want to be good at a riddle, one of the things you need to do is be able to restructure what's being told to you in a way that you are not thinking about it the way they want you to think about it. You're willing to deal with hypotheticals and work on trying to put information in a different way. You have a preference for complexity. That often means you won't get to an answer. You have a preference for complexity instead of simplicity. You like there being many moving parts that are intricately related to one another. Creative people also tend to desire incredibly stimulating interactions. The flip of that is, you can be bored fairly quickly. You can be bored fairly quickly. This plays out particularly when we think of aptitude. Notice I said aptitude instead of intelligence, but we tend to think of those together. So it plays out in terms of the idea of intelligence. And psychology is one discipline that has spent a tremendous amount of time on this, on the concept of intelligence, which we can define as the mental capacity to acquire knowledge, reason, and solve problems effectively. Your mental horsepower, the capacity you have to acquire knowledge, to learn things, to reason through things, to solve problems. To calculate somebody's intelligence, we typically think of as a measure of IQ, intelligence quotient. And to calculate an IQ, it's actually really easy. Scientists have taken people of different ages, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds,